Thank you very much for coming on a particularly cold and wintry evening to this event. So the format this evening is a bit like how we arrange ourselves as a collective. So we pulled straws out of a hat to see who would say what, and I got the introduction. So I'd like to, first of all, say thanks as well as introduce ourselves. Mariam, you are here, Mariam. Thank you very much for producing this exhibition. Also, thank you so much, Anthony, for organising the exhibition, a phenomenal amount of work going into this. Thanks to Juan at the back for doing the AV for us and setting up the microphones. And thank you to Studio Bilaba for doing the graphics. And for all the facilities and the staff and the cleaners who are helping us keep it all really lovely here. So who are we? Some of you know us already, but we are a collective called MOULD. I'm Becca, Jeremy, Tatjana, Christina, and Anthony. We came together 2 years ago now on an AHRC and DFG research grant. And we've been working as a collective ever since. And this exhibition comes midway through the research project, and that's quite purposeful because we want it to be, we weren't even sure about calling it an exhibition, we want it to be a site for kind of activation of different conversations. So it's more like a relay of residencies. We've got some amazing people. If you've picked up a pamphlet, or please do on your way out, which is a timetable of all the stuff that's happening. And we've already had Soft Agency, who I'm delighted are here in the front, Teresa and Gilly. And some other amazing people joining us. So I'll just begin also by introducing or giving a bit of an elevator pitch of the project, and then you'll hear throughout what we're saying that the project's kind of changed and developed quite a bit, but I'll start off with where it was at the beginning. So the premise was architecture as we know it is bound to the modern project, what we're calling the modern project. A project which follows the European tradition of Enlightenment, colonial expansion, industrial revolution, global capital. And our argument is that climate breakdown fundamentally challenges this modern project. It challenges its foundations, its tenets of extraction and growth and progress. And therefore we need to think again. And architecture as we understand it, architecture as we know it, concretizes some of these tenets in its preference for the new, for demolition, for carbon-intensive processes, for not accounting adequately for labor, so on and so forth, and we'll expand on these things. So climate breakdown presents an existential challenge to architecture as we know it, but also an opportunity and a field of great potential. So, what happens? What do we do? How do we know what we do? Another thing we were thinking about early on is if modernity is a project of ordering and organizing knowledge, it's also an exclusion of certain types of knowledge, and that is a peril when we're facing climate emergency. So how could this project take account of a pluralistic multiplicity of types of knowledge, of ways of knowing, of ways of thinking, ways of doing? So we can't solve climate breakdown, and letting go of trying to fix the world is really fundamental to this project and what we've been thinking about in terms of looking beyond the parameters of the modern and thinking about other ways to address climate breakdown, to look elsewhere and to think about the future. And we're going to expand on our thinking about the future when I hand it over. Just before I do, I'd like to say just a couple of things about this exhibition design. Very much, again, looking at Anthony and Mariam for this. So you'll have perhaps noticed when you came in that some of the gallery space is marked off, is inaccessible. And the reason for this is that it's to reflect the fact that the world as it currently stands uses more than one planet's worth of resources. In fact, it uses 1.75 planets. So we wanted to make some of the gallery space inaccessible to represent this overshoot, to represent the excess. And the other thing to note is that everything in the gallery is basically salvaged from previous exhibitions, and this was really in the spirit of our project, of using what's already been and trying to not create too much new. So I'll leave it at that, and I think I'm passing over to Christina next. Thank you.
Thank you, Becca. Is this working? Okay. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the foundations of our project. And based on the premise of this research, as Becca explained, I'm going to walk you through this diagram, which hangs actually on the other side of the room. This diagram, before I explain all the details, was drawn by another member of MOULD called Sarah Bovelet, based in Berlin, who is not here with us tonight, and was commissioned by the James Foundation and the E-Flux Architecture as part of the chronograms of architecture 2023. And we are very happy. Thank you, Lily, for this beautiful invitation. Thank you for coming. So this diagram shows somehow a mountain that is produced by actions that they describe the violence of capitalism's imperative, of endless growth, and the modes of thought that appropriate nature and labor in an exploitative manner. So it represents, in the next slide, it represents global heating, tracing the rise of atmospheric CO2 emissions against a linear time scale in the bottom, and the rising line of greenhouse gas emissions is not an empty abstraction, basically, but it is produced by violent extractive actions shown as sentiments here. It is also a line that it needs to come down. So these actions describe the ways that architecture is bound to the modern project, as Becca explained before, and the ways that dominant architectural production operates and therefore is complicit in climate breakdown. Various conditions that this diagram presents are met against 6 verbs on the left side, ignoring, separating, accumulating, exploiting, band-aiding, and violating. And they're played out within 8 sites of intervention, as we call them, or contexts: economy, policy, resources, land, infrastructure, knowledge, culture, and labor. So we understand these contexts thematically as sites, where you can see the entanglement of architecture and climate, and rather than sites of geographical or topographical terms. So what does this beautiful diagram have to do with architecture? So we think that architecture, as a self-contained discipline, needs to break its boundaries and expand them and work with and within these sites of intervention, become more rational, more relational, more subjective, and more interconnected. So these ways of operating and the conditions that they are producing are shown here as sedimentary layers, and they indicate the causes of climate breakdown rather than the symptoms. So we believe that understanding these conditions is the only way to really face them and resist. So, for example, as you can see here, we're talking about separating, and we're particularly concerned about separating forms of knowledge, humans from nature, labor alienation, and non-relational policies. We are also talking, for example, about exploiting, addressing all the extractive practices, cultural imperialism, and commodification. We are also talking about We have identified band dating, which exposes the ways in which architecture as a discipline offers solutions, scheming of the symptoms of climate breakdown, and the next slide. Actually, we don't want you to see only this diagram through all these violent actions these violent accumulative actions, but actually also through actions of resistance, through actions of solidarity, through actions of hope, through actions of inspirations that exist within gaps in the present. And this is what all these white pockets represent, these pockets of hope, that they are spaces and they're shown as also as vertical rifts. They represent actions of hope, actions of hope and interactions that they are found within spaces of sleepage, as Andy Merrifield talks in his book, Magical Marxism, that create new relationships within space, time, work, that undermine all this, all the violence that of all these extractive actions that you see in all the sentiments. So they create gaps within the dominant systems where all these fragile formations are already emerging, which need support, and bringing them together can create actually new spatial and social relationships. So Professor Jeremy Till can take it from here to expand on the practices.
Just before I do that, just to go back to the diagram. So the practices, futures and foundations is also the diagram of the website that we're working on, to understand that there's a kind of interrelationship, which I'll talk about the practices and then into the future, between the three parts of the website. So the website you will enter and you'll be able to go into all bits, foundations, practices and futures, but they're also, as you'll see, all related to each other. So that the website's a work in progress, so we can't show that, I'm afraid, but that is what we're working towards. So, practices. The first thing to point out, to pick up on Christina, is along that wall are the sites which we believe architecture needs to be part of and to be aware of, because as someone once wrote, architecture depends. And this sense of being aware of these sites which may not be directly obvious within the School of Architecture that you should be aware of, but we think if you look at these as sites of context which new forms of architecture may emerge, then what we've done on these very short texts is say, these are the conditions of culture at the moment, but within the context of climate breakdown, we can see new forms of culture emerging, new forms of policy, new forms of economy. And these are the contexts which the practices, which I'm going to talk about, are responding to. And then on that wall are just, it's like a kind of a brain dump of MOULD, saying these are our favorite quotes, these are our inspirations, these are the books we're reading, these are the pictures we're looking at, and so on and so forth. So the practices are important to us because they are, as Christina says, in a way the inspiration for the gaps in the sediments. That the future often in architecture is seen as this kind of tabula rasa and ungrounded utopias, which you just comes out of your individual genius. Whereas what we're really interested in is to look at practices which are already operating in these gaps and will provide us some kind of sustenance, but also some grounding for the futures. So what we have collected together is a huge range of practices. They go from the Chilean constitution to probably the most architectural one is a retrofit project in Bordeaux. So the Chilean constitution, you may say, what the hell has that got to do with architecture? But if architecture depends, then the sense that you need to be looking around to other forms of emergent practice. And the Chilean constitution, which unfortunately wasn't voted through, but was put together by not quite a citizens' assembly, but an assembly of people, starts with a really simple thing saying the rights of nature are as important as the rights of man. That's an amazing thing to say. And if that then becomes an example for an architectural practitioner in the future, then you think, okay, I need to be aware of that. Equally, you need to be aware of the brilliant work of Lacaton and Versailles in terms of retrofit. And we've gathered together so far 101, and they're pinned up here, practices, which are very, very varied. I mean, I've shown probably the two most extreme, and everything else happens in between. And for each of the practices, what we're doing is that we are, in relation to the diagram, but also the futures, we're saying, these are where we think they are exemplary in engaging in issues of knowledge and culture, and these are the issues that they're dealing with. Violating identities, ignoring other ways, separating forms of knowledge. And therefore, in order to address the causes of climate breakdown, you need to understand how then people are operating within these causes and trying to come out with some kind of redemptive practice. And so each entry has the context which it's operating within, and then a description of the practice. And then also what we've then done, to hand over to Anthony, is to try to look at the practices really carefully and say, well, what can we learn from them or extrapolate from them in terms of forms of action and knowing and methods? And so each of the practices has on the one hand what we used to call the upstream, which is what are the issues it's responding to, what are its sites of intervention. On the other side, what has it done differently, how is it transformed? And so in these ones, then it allows us to build some kind of work pattern about how we might build new futures, so that within the website, if you are trying to think about how I'm going to engage, let's say, in issues of culture against violation, you can track back to a practice to give you some sustenance and some hope that someone else is already doing that. And so futures is handing over to Anthony.
Futures. So after foundations and practices, the third part is about the creation of futures, and that comes about because we've started testing this project in terms of its instrumentality, for want of a better word, in terms of a series of workshops, going and speaking to particularly students, but we're keen to do that with anyone relating to architecture and spatial practice, about what this work might mean to their project in terms of rethinking architectural practice in relation to climate. And one really important aspect of that is we felt that being told by a student in one of those workshops, we get given examples all the time. What we really need to know is what to do with them. So we thought about what to do with them. What's our attitude to how you make a future out of something as exciting as any one of these practices? And we felt that futures are not something that we can determine as a group of authors from something as diverse, interesting, and multiply authored as this set of work. But futures are something that arrive dialogically, that get remade, that become that thought through in situations, in conversations. So what we're proposing for the futures section of this project is not a set of proposals, but a methodology or a process of a workshop plan that can be applied and used, essentially a way of taking up these resources of this project and developing from that. So the second part of the idea of futuring that's core to our project, as others have said, is that futures don't come from nowhere. So futures are a way of building on the things we have. So the futuring aspect of this project is not a way of departing from the things that we're showing here, but we're bringing together the analytic functions of the diagram in terms of the issues and foundations, of analyzing a situation in terms of the fundamental issues and conditions that are around you, of imagining the potential transformation of a site like infrastructure or knowledge, culture, labor, and of thinking then of ways of doing that through the examples that we're offering in the poem particular interpretation. And one thing we do with those examples, one thing we've started to do is define particular forms of action, groupings of forms of action which appear on this animation in the center of the room, which are ways of getting to. And they're ways of getting to which are not about future as something distant, but future as all of these things kind of already being futures in the sense of alternative possible presence. So, So it's about the emergence of a future from the things that are being suppressed, the replacement of, we were speaking with someone about that diagram, he said, well, the really dominant color on that diagram right now is black. The replacement of the black in the diagram with the white expanding the cracks. So the methodology is about using these forms of action in terms of starting with where you are in project or practice or policy or something you might be working on, or your career direction, and mapping that in relation to those conditions on the end of the wall. And we started to do this through various versions with students and others, and of identifying in that mapping, which might be a form of diagram like this, or might be other kinds of illustration, description, some moments or sites of intervention. Sorry, I keep pointing to the back wall, which is all behind you, where you might intervene, which you might be able to transform. And the description of a transformed condition being helped by examples in the database. So all these forms of action always relate back to very particular things, but are interpreted in a particular way. And we're proposing this method to then establish a number of actions that you might take to get there. So you're looking at a transformed condition, and this is from a workshop that Christina ran with some really exciting practitioners. If you're looking at a transformed condition, what actions might you take to get there? And then finally describing what's changed in terms of a reimagined form of practice that might generate a different form of climate. And what?
So this diagram is quite important because it puts on some of the forms of action that we're finding in the practices, grouping them underneath the sites, and then what Christina's friends did was to take a project and say, okay, I'm coming through, okay, I'm looking at policy and these words help me. And then they move through. In that, their project became in some way redescribed. Is that right?
And then the final one, so just, that's a very different example of a type of response. But the point of all this is we're kind of moving between the very, very particular, tangible, the analytical, the existing, and the very projective, the very imaginative, the very transformed, and trying to create routes between those two places.
Okay. So I'm going to pull you back into the past before I go back into the future again. When we wrote the grant application, and that was, I think, at some point in 2020 or so, the project was called Architecture After Architecture, Spatial Practice in the Face of Climate Breakdown. And embedded in this title, and also very much in the description of the project, is a lot of, maybe in lack of a better word, opposition. So there was a lot of critique of the status quo. There was a lot of critique about, and of the world around us, and all of that was omnipresent in this early text. And we were, and maybe this is also the nature of grant applications for those of us who've written these before, because in grant applications you have to set yourself you have to make a pitch, you have to put yourself in the front, in the center, and you say what you're going to do is, and how that what you're planning to do is maybe going to be different to what other people have done before you. As well, claiming innovation and also novelty always at all cost. So we were in this text taking issue with all that architecture is, and I think we all, whenever I come to London, it's right in my face. So as I exit St. Pancras, and I'm right in the middle of this. Financialization, and we just have to step out of this building and it's right in your face. There's no escape. Architecture also as products that are bought and sold as at profit. Architecture that is very often also ignorant of social and ecological well-being. Architecture, and this is what Christina and Becca already talked about, and what is so present in this blackness of the diagram, that is complicit and made possible by colonial structures of exploitation, so still ongoing structures of exploitation. It's complicit in producing enclosures, and also this is something that we see when we step out of this building here. Architecture also very often being a silent participant in these kind of happy world narratives in which building and ever more building is advertised as panacea. So in Germany we have a situation where we have a big housing crisis, and we're told that only building and ever more building will actually solve the housing crisis, when it's actually very often also to do with how space is distributed amongst different groups of people. Architecture is greenwashed and whitewashed. It's very often, it's an ethics-free zone. It's a space where words don't mean a lot, but pull you in and think emperor's new clothes. And just a couple of days ago, I think, when the Pritzker Prize was announced, we can actually see that the so-called starchitecture and starchitects are still lingering with absolute perseverance. And it's, apologies for that, no, but it's true, no? So, yeah. And architecture is built with and out of oil, and there was something, wasn't there, about keeping stuff in the ground, and architecture, despite all claims to the otherwise, business as usual. So architects attempting to pencil, and we talked about this as well, to scribble and to write and draw their way out of climate breakdown. And of course, this is not all there is to architecture. Of course, there isn't. Anthony spoke about this, Jeremy spoke about this as well, and of course our project is going into a very direction, but I think it's very important to frame this mountain in its sort of massiveness, and also talk about what it actually, what the world that we're in means. So architecture is, and there's absolutely no way around it, it's absolutely violent. And this happens, and we've mentioned these points already. You see these in the yellow sheets on this long wall. Now, it sits in policy, it sits in the way labor is connected to architecture, it sits in the infrastructures that carry architecture. It's to do with how land is used, it's to do with how knowledge and culture and labor and resources are exploited and put in use again. And you might begin to see that even to speak of architecture after architecture is quite stifling. No? It's full of despair, and you can hear that in my voice, I think. It's trembling. No? I sort of, it trembles when I talk about this world around me. It's bringing many of us to a halt, and is very often also prompting what we also always call solutionism with full force. No? If the problem is financialization, right, let's work on solutions against financialization. If oil-based products are a problem, let's design oil-free products. If we don't have ethics now, let's write a manifesto, a charter, a code of conduct, or if the language we use is wrong, just make it better. And so don't get me wrong, No? Yes to all that, but at the same time, all of this does not capture the severity of the situation, which needs different frameworks, and this is what this project is about. Different mindsets, different references that make interconnectedness, interdependencies, dependencies, the multiple entanglements of which Becca already spoke, not just visible, but also workable, approachable, whilst making architecture part of the wider systemic change that climate calls for, the futures. So we turned this on its head, this architecture after architecture thing, questioned the oppositional framework that is inherent in those that was inherent in this initial title, and reversed the question, and we shifted also gear to get away from this all-consuming and architecture's ever-present certainty. No? And if we wanted to speak with Donna Haraway, we would say staying with the trouble. And out came Architecture is Climate, which is also the name of this program here. Which puts architecture's multiple vulnerabilities, no? So labor, infrastructure, knowledge, culture, resources, no? We define those as vulnerabilities as well in the center of attention, which, true, complicates matters, but it also names things by the name they have. It stops with the obfuscating, the hiding, and the niceness of sustainability discourses which promise futures but often do little more than sugarcoat.
And I'm not sure, I've got a short-term memory, so maybe we didn't also talk about the reversal of the question. We haven't, okay. So there were two big shifts in the project. The first was to go from architecture after architecture, and the second towards architecture's climate. And the second, which sounds really simple, is to reverse the normal question, which is, what can architecture do for the climate emergency? I.e. that we are a form of saviour, that we are a set of expert doctors who are going to put nice sticking plasters of greenwash onto the failing body of the planet. That question, what can architecture do, treats climate emergency as something outside of architecture, and therefore doesn't allow the kind of complicit nature and the entanglement of architecture and climate to come to the front. So we reverse that very simply, but just by saying, what does climate breakdown do to architecture? If climate breakdown is accompanied by a set of systemic changes, the systemic changes also happen within architecture. And this might seem, within Tatjana and I's previous kind of incarnations, as just a form of criticality. But as I hope that what is coming through from what we've all said is that, in a way, it's an act of care to say architecture is climate, because it makes us all, as Tatjana said, vulnerable. It gets us away from the sense that we are controlling or experts who can fix a problem, and brings us all together in a position of vulnerability as both humans and professionals, which then allows us to look at climate and work with climate rather than on climate. And Anthony came up also with a very nice construction, which I'll hand over and ask him to do, which I've forgotten. But I think also this idea of architecture as climate also entangles us in climate rather than keeping it at a distance. And it's that entanglement which we think is going to be productive rather than just a form of kind of pure criticality. What was your nice construction, Anthony?
I think what you're asking, which is the hopeful side of architecture as climate, is the suggestion, if you entangle the architecture within climate, if you say that processes of architecture are processes of production of climates, then other possible architectural processes are also other possible climates, and that's where it feels slightly, and that's
Okay, good. So I go back to the sites of intervention, the possible sites of intervention, which is again also those 8 words behind you on the back of this wall. They do not come as a numbered list, and this is again, I think, quite an important thing to say, because lists again give a false impression maybe of something that can be worked through and ticked off, and once you get to the end of the list, you'll be all right, because you've ticked off the last thing on the box, but we know that we simply won't be. And we simply won't be, and this is also, I think, inherent in picking of those words, is because the unsustainability that surrounds us is structural. Like many other things, the unsustainability is structural. And this brings to mind, of course, Arturo Escobar, who speaks of the necessity to eliminate the structures of unsustainability. And those structures are complex, and they're intertwined, and they're designed to uphold power, privilege, and status quo. But this is where our field of action, our field as academics, as architects, as citizens maybe also, has to be and must be, and what Architecture is Climate captures in this reversal of the question. And it also talks about what the scope of architecture, of what Architecture is Climate is. Because for climate justice, and this is something we write on these walls as well, for climate justice to become real and a real possibility, we do need this wholesale change that prioritizes people and planet over profit and endless growth. We need to challenge, of course, top-down policies, and we mentioned already the Chilean constitution, and there's many other examples which do just that. So that these kind of silos of anthropocentric policies become a thing of the past. And very clearly, stuff will have to be kept in the ground. But most of all, and I think this is really important, and this is what we actually want to achieve, and this is where Anthony pointed this out already, where we need your help as well, where we need everyone's help. We need to quit stalling. It's absolutely urgent, right? And this is something we've known for a long time, but it needs to be said again and again. So with that, on a negative note, maybe someone wants to pick that up again and pull us back into the futures.